So in this panel, well, let me say, what you're getting right now is the result of our efforts to try to come up with some sort of a checklist or a typology or a system where we list all the possible line items that are relevant in a surrogacy journey. Okay? So the reason this is not such a straightforward undertaking is that this is not, very obviously conventional commercial process of any sort. In fact, it's a commercial process at all. So it's hard for somebody to just come up with a cost sheet. And by all means, nobody interpret this that this is the cost sheet for how much a child costs. This is not what it is. It's what it is our attempts to try to estimate what are the expenses and the costs associated with this journey. And we polled a few providers. Granted, for the United States, we have a larger sample, but here we worked with some of the providers, and we asked you all for your input. And what we try to come up with is a system that has at least those line items that we can expect in a journey. And for each one of them, what we think is the minimum we can get away with, what we know is a much higher end of the spectrum. I wouldn't say the maximum, because, of course, the sky's the limit. And then what's more importantly, what we think is a likely amount for these various components that you can expect or orient around, put that in context or for your expectations. There are two sheets here. There's a page that explains what I'm trying to say very quickly now, but there are two sheets. The first sheet is about the surrogacy agency and the surrogate. That's only one part. The second sheet is about the egg donation and the IVF component, which is something we know a little more precisely about. The first sheet is what we're going to try to mostly concentrate on at this talk now. So before I move forward, let me also mention something. As I said before, while we dive into this as informed consumers, I want to say first that this is about having a baby. And unfortunately, we have a guy at our San Francisco conference that always comes with a bottle of wine and some lingerie, whatever. He says that's how heterosexual people have a child. Now we're going to work with Excel sheets and lawyers and doctors, and this is how we have to have a child. So this is the reality, but we want to be at least informed about it. So to start off, I would say, going back to what we said before, we think as an organization that this is a process that could be done ethically, and it could be a beautiful process, a beautiful journey. We think that the surrogates deserve compensation, not reimbursement, not expense packages. We tiptoe around this issue here in Canada because of the law. So the law here, we think, is unfair to the surrogates, first and foremost, because it makes them, I think it's below their dignity to dance around this topic and pretend that this is only about reimbursement. So I'm saying that so you guys don't have to say that, okay? I'm on record, I'm fine saying it. We think that surrogates deserve a compensation. Why? Not because they work for you, not because they're selling something to you, not because they're renting something to you. Those of you who speak Spanish, that's how they call surrogacy, renting a womb. We don't think that that's what they're being paid for. We think they're being paid for because they are first and foremost going through physical discomfort. This is not something that you get paid for as a job, but if you go under physical discomfort in the process of doing a favor to somebody else, we think you deserve a compensation. This journey disrupts their lives significantly. Disrupts their lives, the lives of their family. That's not something that has to do with the job or the job market. But we think when somebody does a favor to you and disrupt their lives significantly, they deserve a compensation. They're also taking medical risk. And we think when somebody is willing to go on the line and help you and in the process is taking on some risk, we think that deserves compensation too. So the terminology we like to use in these terms is not terminology that has to do with the workplace. The surrogate doesn't get paid more if she's good at it, if she spends more time at it, if she is somehow produces something better for you. Even in the United States, she doesn't get paid more if the baby is this weight or that weight. If the baby is healthy, the baby doesn't even, unfortunately, survive. She gets paid for the discomfort, the disruption, and the risk. So we think that, we hope that one day in Canada that would be acknowledged, and we know a lot of you are, and I hope you will help, are trying to make that reality so that we stop pretending. We think that Canada right now has gray surrogacy. It's not, nobody's just acknowledging. And I know sometimes things could work like this forever. But I think the first and foremost, it's below the dignity of the surrogates to do it this way. So having said that, from now on, we're going to use some euphemisms here, like the reimbursement package. In the United States, we call it a compensation package. So having put that out of the way, I want to, first of all, introduce our panel. So we have Cathy here from our fair godmother and Surrogacy Stork. Stork, do you have a new name now? Or?
No.
Okay, I thought it was something with wellness or something. Okay.
No.
Okay, good. Terrific. Brianne from Canadian Fertility Consulting. You met her before briefly. And we have Judy from Canadian Surrogacy Options. So thank you all for coming and helping us with this. And as I said, I, did not know much about this. We do have guys that we have been taking for the last few years through this at our GPAP stage 2. So, and Lisa, where's Lisa here? Lisa worked very hard on this. She's our GPAP. That's fine. She's our GPAP manager, and she got a lot of these numbers with the help of these providers. So the first thing I want to do before we dive into the actual numbers is, because that requires that's required background, is just ask you guys, gals, how do surrogates get matched? In the United States, you go to an agency, you pay, and you get in the queue. So we'll start with you, Cathy. Is it the same with Canadian surrogates?
How we match our...
Yeah, I mean, when these guys decide they want to move forward with you, is there a queue? Is there a list? Is there a database you have of surrogates? Or do you have to do it a little differently because of the laws here?
Well, I think that there's always more of a demand than a supply everywhere. However, we have, what we do is we pre-screen our surrogates before we present a surrogate to an intended parent. So because of my background, having worked in reproductive medicine since 1990, I do a full review of their medical records and follow the guidelines of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which is basically the international guidelines of screening someone. And so that when your surrogate gets to the point where she goes to the clinic for screening, your doctor already has the medical records, and she's already got medical clearance, psychological clearance. So when you see a profile, she's actually ready to go.
We're going to have to actually be very quick about some of these so we can get numbers. Brianne, is that something that you can't quite do in Canada? I know, Cathy, you operate from the United States to some extent.
So in Canada, we operate the same way with our agency. Okay. So our surrogates go through an intake process where they have a full overview of their birth history, their birth experiences, kind of who they are as a people, what their family is like, what kind of support they have for them in their own personal lives. The exact same situation we have with intended parents, where we do an intake with them. And then we match people together based on communication beliefs, termination values, and post-birth expectations, and all of those different things kind of go into account. So it's not necessarily about being in a lineup, it's more so about finding the perfect surrogate for you. So if we had someone who just entered our program, a woman also entered our program, and they were going to be a great fit, we would match them, not based on where they came into the program, but based on them having a successful journey and feeling comfortable moving forward.
Judy, is there anything else that you want to add, or is it?
Yeah, I just would add that our process is very surrogate driven. So our surrogates will review profiles based on the criteria they've given us. So they'll let us know, I'd like to work with someone internationally or Canadian or different criteria like that, and we'll circulate profiles to them based on that. And then she lets us know who she would like to work with.
Well, cool.
The connection between the
I
intent.
just thought that there was some prohibition in the law from you being the matcher.
The prohibition is that you cannot be paid for a match in Canada. So our agency, we do not accept any fees until after the match has already been confirmed.
Okay,
So
got it.
you're matched with a surrogate, you communicate for 2 weeks, you feel comfortable in that relationship, she feels comfortable in that relationship, everyone's comfortable to move forward, and at that point we accept fees. So our matching service is actually completely complimentary.
Got it. Okay. So that's a little bit of a workaround, but that's good for you. Okay. So let's move on with the issue. Once again, I think if that's how it's done, the law should be kind enough to acknowledge that that's what it makes sense, and nobody's being
We're working on it.
unethical for doing that. But moving forward, so we have what would otherwise in the United States be called the compensation package. This is the first line under the GC reimbursement package in your sheets. And I know, and by the way, everything here is Canadian dollars. If those of you are American, that's good news. Let me start with Judy now, so we can go back and forth like that. For the reimbursement part that is not dependent on particular contingencies like travel, etc., how does that range? And also, how is that? To what extent does it get negotiated, or what does that depend on? And I'm not talking about travel and other things.
Right. That not the variables.
Yes, not the variables.
Yeah. So I think we will tell our intended parents to expect anywhere from $25,000 and up. We take our guidance directly from the lawyers on that, and we want to make sure that we're staying within the law, of course. So when we look at reimbursements, that's very much a part of the contract process, which is very much part of the lawyer process. So they guide us through that, and when it comes to breaking down that reimbursement schedule is what we call it. Yeah.
And Brianne, do some surrogates ask for more or expect, is it usually different for some types of surrogates or regions?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's different. I think that we did an anonymous survey 2 years ago. We were gathering information for our working towards legislative change, where we interviewed surrogates about their reimbursement expectations. And actually 99% of the 600 women that we interviewed were completely comfortable with the amount that Julia was speaking of. So frequently in our program, we see a very similar amount to that. I would say almost exactly the same. And that's kind of an across the board. It's really heavily communicated with surrogates when they enter the program, what a reimbursement is, what that is for, what that includes, a breakdown of everything. And communication is really key for us to make sure that everyone knows what's going on. And we do work really closely with lawyers, as Julia said, to make sure that we're maintaining those boundaries and moving forward as best we can.
What about first time versus experienced surrogate? Is that something that is arranged?
There is sometimes a difference with that. It also depends if you have a surrogate who's a doctor, her lost wages would be more, but that's more a variable expense. So a fixed expense for everyone would be quite similar. But when you look at variable expenses, such as lost wages, childcare, if she has more than one child, her childcare expense would be more. If she's traveling further to a clinic, her travel expense would be more. So the variable
if one of these guys says, I would be more comfortable having a surrogate help me that already helped somebody else, would that typically put them on the higher end of the spectrum?
I think if you found a surrogate that was an experienced surrogate that was a stay-at-home mom with 1 to 2 children that wouldn't have those other variable expenses that might be more, it would value out to be the same cost. But during a consultation and throughout the process, you would communicate kind of what your budget is and what kind of the financial need is, and you'd be matched with someone that there wouldn't be 6 months into the pregnancy, they're on bed rest and it's $5,000 a week and you had no idea that that's what it was going to be.
Okay. Cathy, anything?
Yeah, every surrogate is going to have different expenses. So as we're interviewing them, one of the things that we're evaluating is what are her expenses, so that when we're doing the matching, we're able to communicate that what that particular surrogate's expenses are in comparison to another surrogate's expenses, because they will be different.
Okay. So, Brianne, what happens if So there's an amount negotiated, let's say $30,000, which we think is, somewhere in the, in the range of what is likely. And the surrogate, and there's a miscarriage. Or the surrogate delivers early, only 7.5 months into the pregnancy. Are those would that number end up being less?
So the number could definitely change. It's a human process. There's lots of different things that happen, but all of that would be already negotiated in your contract. So your lawyer would discuss that with you. You would have an expectation of that. She would have an expectation of that. And depending on when she delivered or when the miscarriage occurred, it would be dependent on a per contract basis. So it's kind of difficult to answer a generalized question, but it definitely is something that would be sorted out with the lawyers. You would both have signed the contract knowing that if you did miscarry at this time, this is how much it would be. If you did miscarry at this time, this is how much it would be, and the different expectations.
Expenses would be provided up until a certain point. So if somebody miscarried at 12 weeks, they may not receive any further reimbursement of their expenses unless they did another transfer. Or if they chose not to continue on a journey.
So there is the length of the pregnancy is certainly a factor in the in that number, the $30,000.
Right.
It's going to be $30,000 if it's a normal pregnancy.
Right, yeah.
That's the anticipated expenses that you may expect going to term.
Judy, you wanted to add something?
No, I was just going to add that would again all be stipulated in the contract, and it would speak to gestational stage, at what point, if a delivery were early, and how that reflects in the reimbursement schedule, stopping or starting, or how that looks.
Wonderful. So let's talk about some of the variable expenses. So you guys can see that there's $30,000 as a likely expense up front, and then there's things that are being itemized beyond the package of regular reimbursements, which, by the way, the agencies administer, correct? You guys don't have to collect receipts from the surrogate.
Right.
That's something that you're being spared until the Canadian government decides to spare all of us from that. So there's life insurance that doesn't have to be explained so much. But then there's the surrogates take 2 trips, and then there's also clothing I see here. So I guess that just has to do with the actual costs. So the surrogates have to come for the screening. The surrogates have to come for the transfer, of course. Do these numbers seem reasonable to all three of you?
Yes.
For
Yes.
that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what that means is that if the surrogate lives around the corner from the clinic, that's going to be much, much less.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And then maybe we'll talk about, first of all, the bed rest that happens after the delivery. So Judy, you want to explain a little bit about how does it work, at least on your side?
Yeah, sure. We usually see that extended for a 6-week period, which is a typical recovery for after delivery. So the surrogate can still maintain submitting reimbursements for travel. At that point, there would be things like her checkup after delivery, and there might be travel involved in that and that kind of thing. Lost wages might come into play there too if she takes a period of time off. And that's what it would look like after delivery. Before delivery is, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say they are entitled to apply for maternity
Yes, as well.
benefits, which will provide them with 55% of their net lost wages, so that if the intended parents do have to provide, you do have to provide with the difference, but you're only providing the difference of what unemployment insurance isn't paying, which is great for Canada.
Yeah. And you would
Right
know as well when you were selecting a surrogate what her post-birth lost wages would be, and if she was topped up by EI or not.
That's written in your direct agreement. You'll know exactly what the number is per day.
So Brianne, if I did come to you and I say, I'm very budget conscious. You alluded to that before a little bit.
Yes.
So what's that unicorn surrogate that, because there are some things here, of course, when we came up with the 1440 for the post-birth bed rest, and of course there's bed rest that could occur for medical reasons during the pregnancy, and that would be something that you would be committed to paying in the contract as well. That particular number, let alone the travel and all these other things, very much depend. So can somebody come to you and say, please find me what would that surrogate profile be?
So absolutely. At the end of the day, it is still a human process. Someone can have had 5 absolutely perfect vaginal deliveries with no complications, leave the hospital an hour afterwards and have no problems, and end up in an emergency C-section with bed rest. When you're dealing with human beings, there always is that room for variables, but definitely a surrogate that is a stay-at-home mom that wouldn't have that high lost wage expense, that would live close to the clinic where you are, but really more important than focusing on being budget conscious obviously is important, and you have as much money as you have, but really finding a surrogate that you can communicate with for an extended period of time, that you can have that lasting relationship with, really is more important. It is already a good chunk of money that you're spending. If you were going to buy a really nice car and it didn't have air conditioning.
Which is not how we compare that to, but.
But it's the same thing. If you're spending a large sum of money, it's not about the amount that you're spending necessarily. It's about the relationship that you have with your surrogate. It's about finding the perfect match for you. It's about finding that unicorn that for you, that you might walk into this process thinking, I'm going to have this surrogate and it's going to cost this much money. And then you see someone's profile and it's completely different than what you expected, but you just feel drawn to them.
And I appreciate that. But Cathy, let's say before I fell in love with anybody on your list,
Right.
and before it became personal that way, if I wanted to even ask you not to show me profiles of Serene because my budget, what would you say? What are the variables that you would need to look for?
Right, I actually try to be quite specific with the expenses so that, in fact, before I show the intended parents a profile, because we don't want to have somebody end up with even $5,000 of extra expenses that they weren't anticipating.
So what would it be? We said stay-at-home mom, typically.
Yeah. So I'll lay out all those expenses. So if I'm approaching you and you're my client, and I will say, so I have this surrogate, and this is her salary, and I will have outlined all that already myself for each one of my surrogates. So I'll be able to tell someone, this is her daily wage if we deduct the 55%, if she were to have 6 weeks of.
And is everybody eligible for that 55%? Not everybody.
All Canadians.
If they're working outside the home.
If they're working outside of the home and they have
So if somebody's a
accumulated so
freelance
many,
marketing person at home,
if she's paying into it, you have to pay
she's
into
not
it.
going to get the 55%.
If you pay into it.
Yeah, you have to pay.
But the client, the intended parents are gonna know.
Yeah, they would know.
Yeah, because that's one question that we're going to ask. Do you qualify for unemployment insurance?
Yeah.
Have you paid into it? And if they don't have enough weeks, if they've not paid into it for enough weeks, so which living in the United States, people are unfamiliar with because there's no such thing. But, yeah.
So Judy, if I came to you and I told you, listen, I'm very budget conscious, find me the surrogate with a small minimalist house that doesn't require a lot of house cleaning, yet an 18-year-old child, a single child, she doesn't work at all, but yet she got this whatever. Then she won't need that lost wages.
This woman doesn't exist, I'm just
And I told you,
It doesn't work.
I'm going to wait until you find me this woman.
I think the biggest point for everybody to understand is just that this is all going to be discussed before the go button is pushed.
But at the very least, there's going to be a longer wait time for that particular.
Potentially, but for us anyways, your profile is going to be circulating, and if that profile spoke to a surrogate and that worked for her, then that would work. It's just kind of, it's a matter of time is what we always say. Yeah.
But would you say that that if I came to you and I said, money's not an object, but I want to do it really quickly, then you probably tell me, don't ask for, be open to somebody that is an architect working from home without.
Well, the more restrictions you have, the longer it might take. But there's a lid for every pot.
Yeah. And it is too about there's more than just the budget as well. These are two people. You're a human being, she's a human being, and it's really important to keep that in mind as well, that there is more than just that side of things. That sometimes it can take a little bit longer, but it's the right fit is better than the cheap.
I'm convinced about that, but I was just trying to talk about the cost now, so I know I'm taking the devil's advocate's role here. Let me ask you something, because it was mentioned briefly before. and that is not something directly you deal with, but can most of these guys here benefit from the free IVF cycle?
Yeah.
If you live in the province of
If they're
Ontario.
under 43.
How does that work? Go ahead, Cathy.
Well, if they're under the age of 43, yes.
If the intended parents are under the age of
Uh-huh.
43?
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, so, go ahead, and I can jump in.
So funded IVF in the province of Ontario, there's multiple different clinics. I think the majority of clinics participate in that program. So they would have spots available for funded IVF. You would talk to us. We would give you clinic suggestions based on what you need. You would find a donor, create embryos at the clinic, and then move forward with a funded IVF cycle. You do have to have your surrogate and your donor secured before you start the process, so that part is a little bit different. But if you communicated that any citizen in the province of Ontario that's available to them.
So it's just Ontario right now?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
The donor, your surrogate, and yourselves all have to be Ontario residents with Ontario
So what's the
health
flip
cards.
side? Does it take longer? Are not all the clinics
No.
part of that?
No, it doesn't necessarily take longer. I don't think every clinic larger clinics have more spots for funded IVF, smaller clinics have less spots for funded IVF, but it doesn't necessarily affect a wait time. It's a little bit different, findangling the process of that you would find your donor and your surrogate before you move forward with the medical process, whereas in a different situation, you would start the medical process and then find your surrogate sometimes, in our program anyways. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a longer wait time.
The funded program does not pay for any embryology work, doesn't pay for any medications, doesn't pay for like embryo freezing, sperm freezing, ICSI, genetic testing.
Can you supplement
and doesn't,
those?
You
Yes,
have to
yeah,
pay
you
for
would
that
have to.
yourself.
Okay.
So, but what it's paying for is the donor IVF cycle. It's paying for embryo transfer for all of your embryos until you've used them all up. So
Do you
you're
guys know
paying for
about
your
that?
storage.
This is really good news.
Yeah, so you're paying for the storage of your embryos, is your pre-implantation genetic screening, any of your donor screening, your surrogate screening, your surrogate's medications,
So
your
how
donor
much
meds.
does that on average, if you can tell me, save?
Saving a lot of money.
It's
Well,
so
it's
many.
it's the other side of the page.
So,
Saves you that much money.
so you guys, when you speak to the providers you're about to choose, and if you're lucky enough to be a resident of Ontario, then by all means, ask that question.
Quebec did offer it, and they stopped the program, I want to say 2 years ago.
BC
So-
is on the way.
You think
say.
it might not last in Ontario?
I think it will definitely last in Ontario.
Yeah.
So who's on the way?
I think BC is.
BC.
Yes.
Okay, good.
So any of your donor, it's your clinical costs. So your medical screening for your donor, your surrogate, intended parent screening, all of that's covered. So where it's not is your IVF lab fees tend to not be covered. So for any of your embryology work. So it's a significant savings if you can see that.
Yeah,
You may only end up being maybe $5,000 out of pocket, plus your pre-implantation genetic screening,
But it
which
doesn't cover all subsequent cycles. It only
it covers all transfers.
With
You
that
get
set of
one,
embryos.
One time.
well, I think
One journey.
each intended parent can have a cycle.
Yeah.
So if you're doing two, you each get one.
Oh, so if the genetic dad is different,
Yeah,
Yeah.
then you get
They each
another
get-
cycle.
And there is a stipulation that it's only one embryo. There's no,
Okay,
Yeah.
which is the same stipulation
Yeah.
we have for
Right.
GPAP,
Yeah.
so that's terrific.
Yeah.
Last thing I want to cover, because as I mentioned, this is an abbreviated first take at this, is the insurance issue. Once again, how many people here are not Canadians or do not reside in Canada? Okay, so with Cathy, you have an American. I know, well, you all have American clients, but why don't you start? What happens if they're not American? If they're not Canadians, they
What's
don't
your
reside
question?
in Canada. What's the main difference financially from the insurance standpoint?
in what regard? Like,
Well,
what do you
the
want?
surrogate would still be insured, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what about the newborns?
For a foreign client, they can purchase newborn insurance. There's two companies that most of my clients that work with. One is Alliance, and the other is Lloyd's of London, New Life. We'll sell newborn insurance, but Alliance is actually quite reasonable.
So do you also mostly use Alliance?
Yeah, so we primarily use Alliance. So any non-Canadian citizen in our program must have insurance. They sign a waiver stating that they will get insurance, so that there isn't that toll on our healthcare system. Obviously, the pregnancy is covered up until the baby is born, and insurance would cover kind of the duration. There is no insurance for multiple pregnancies, for twins, so it would be a singleton pregnancy, and the baby would be fully covered, and it's ranges in between, I think it's $10,000 to $12,000.
Still Canadian dollars? Because that's, and
Alliance will not cover you if you are HIV positive, even if you're on medication.
wow.
So I have a client that was denied insurance.
Huh. And so the baby always in this case is covered by that insurance. If you're international and you're coming, is there a limited time period during which you need to do this insurance, or?
Yeah, so you have to apply for the insurance
6 months before, so that would be prompted in that first trimester to make sure if that's what you want to do. In our case, you guys do it beforehand, but for us, we would prompt that in that first trimester. If that's something you want to do, let's get that solidified at that point. And then that's the stipulation there, as long as it's secured 6 months before delivery.
Generally speaking, once you've got that ultrasound, live birth, you've gotten through that first trimester, or you're at the end of the first trimester, you know that
Still not too late.
yeah, that's you want to have it then.
And you do have 30 days as well to cancel the insurance if anything were to happen without penalty.
So it's important to try to time it.